Morning, everybody. Nice to see some familiar faces, some with different surnames from when I first met them. And the volunteers, hi, Elaine, good to see you. Are you well? Yes, good. So yeah, and I recognize some faces from our focus groups as well that we conducted. So yeah, my name's Dirk Schubotz. I'm a senior lecturer in social policy, and probably like most of you, long time volunteer as well at the same time. So I'm responsible for the Young Life and Times study, which is undertaken by both universities in Queen's and Ulster University here in Northern Ireland. Study of 16-year-olds, and we've included questions on volunteering in the past, and we've had a couple of projects with Denise and her team, and even going back to when it was still a volunteer service bureau. So that's how long back our relationship goes, really. And I'm speaking with Eddie today, who will co-present some of our findings. It's the first time I've worked with Eddie, but Eddie will introduce himself. And it's been a pleasant experience, so that's great. And Eddie is much more an expert in volunteering matters than I would be, and that will probably become evident when he talks about the policies. So the plan for today, and I'm going to share my screen now, and please alert me if you can't see that. Hopefully you will. So the plan for today is that we're going to take you through some of the findings. No, I believe, Denise, you will probably make the report available to everybody. Yeah, comments are warmly received from everyone. So what we're going to do is we are going to talk a little bit about the aims and objectives of the study. So we started that in sort of the end of September, October, when the tender went out, and Eddie and I and the small team at Queen's came together then to put the tender application in, and then the work started properly, probably at the start of November, and we've finished the last data collection right now, about 4 weeks ago, and the report is just finished now. So the objectives were really to review the existing data sets that we have available on volunteering in Northern Ireland. So it's a secondary data analysis to look at the youth volunteering policy in Northern Ireland and compare this to other parts in the UK. And that's why Eddie came on board with our team. And then we conducted some focus groups. And again, I recognize some of the participants here. 2 focus groups with policymakers and volunteer involving organizations, and 2 focus groups with young people as well. And our job was to provide some recommendations, and I've added those at the end of today's presentation as well. And obviously very much recognizing that these are recommendations which come from an academic perspective, and hopefully you will have a lot to say about that. And I know there are workout groups organized for that. So I just want to quickly talk about the methodology. So as I already said, Eddie will talk in a minute about the policy context in the UK and contextualize the Northern Ireland situation within that. And so that is work that he's undertaken in Kent. And then the rest of the work for the project was undertaken here at Queen's, and we had 2 colleagues involved with that. Martina McKnight, who really carried the bulk of the workload, to be honest, in relation to the secondary data analysis, the literature reviews. Some of that was built on previous work that we had undertaken on behalf of UNGNO and also for our surveys. So the surveys involved with that, and I have had some input in that as well. But again, Martina, who can't be here today, was the main person. The surveys we've been looking at is a continuous household survey. So that's an adult survey, which is undertaken, well, as the name suggests, in the households of people. So interviewers go out to people's homes, and it's a random sample across Northern Ireland. The survey is longitudinal, so that means that the people are revisited over time again and again. And that is run by the Northern Ireland Statistical Research Agency, or NISRA. The other survey we've been looking at is the Young Person's Behaviour and Attitude Survey, or YBAS, as it's also known. So that's a post-primary schools-based survey. So the issue with that is that, that survey goes out every 2 years or so. Sometimes there's a bigger gap between the survey sweeps, goes out to all post-primary schools or sample of post-primary schools. And the questions are asked of people in the classroom setting. So one class per school is then selected to take part in the study. Issue, of course, with that is that you're relying on gatekeepers, school principals, whether or not the schools participate, or what group of young people they will give the survey questionnaire to. And of course, post-primary is 12 to 18. And as you all know, those of you who work in volunteer involving organizations, there'll be some level of volunteering for younger people in the school, but usually volunteering and sort of in communities doesn't start at 16. So of course, so the limit is in terms of asking questions about community-based volunteering is that you're really looking at GCSE onwards. The other survey is Young Life and Times, which, as I said before, is the survey that I'm responsible for, which has run since 2003. So that's a postal survey or an online survey now for the second year. It's actually currently in the field since Monday. It's the second time we've run it as an online-only survey. Of course, it won't come as a surprise to you that we started online only due to COVID last year, but it worked really well, and so we kept it. The difference between YBAS and YLT is that it goes out to young people's homes, so we use the home addresses, so there's no gatekeeper involved, so it's the young people themselves deciding whether they want to take part or not. Limitation is it's only 16-year-olds, so they're all 16 when they take part. So the older young people, or the ones who are 15, 14, we don't capture with that survey. And then there were a couple of surveys we also looked at, which were commissioned by Volunteer Now, undertaken by NISRA, also SMR, survey methods research, a private market research company, and these were surveys related to COVID-19 or post-COVID and how volunteering related to that. So as you can see, one of the obvious difficulties with all of that is that the sampling is different, the age groups are different, the methodologies is different, so there are some obvious limitations with that. But overall, hopefully, as Eddie and I will show you, the picture that's emerging is quite consistent in relation to youth volunteering. So we're quite confident in relation to these surveys, and also then focus groups that we've conducted, that we are quite confident that the recommendations that we make are based on solid evidence that we collected throughout all these databases and the focus groups. Yeah, so the focus groups were the only sort of new evidence that we produced for this report. And EMB stands for Emily Mitchell-Bajic, was a now completed PhD student that we recruited to undertake these focus groups with us. So it was Martina and Emily who ran this with policymakers and volunteer involving organizations, and these were run via MS Teams online. And Emily and myself went out to speak with young people as well, and that was face-to-face. So we met young people directly in the organizations where they were based. Okay, so that's for the background. And at this point, I'm handing over to Eddie, who will give us some information about the context of the policy around volunteering.
Thanks, Dirk. Yeah, so just to introduce myself, I'm also a senior lecturer in social policy, but based at the University of Kent, down in southeast England, and have done various bits of work, including with I Will and others on youth volunteering over the last 5 or 6 years. And with the policy work, there were kind of two main strands that I wanted to look at. The first was understanding the policy context for youth volunteering in Northern Ireland, and then the second was understanding that comparative to the other 3 nations of the United Kingdom. So on that first part, I had to go back to 2012 to the most recent national volunteering strategy in Northern Ireland, which is the incredibly snappily named Join In, Get Involved, Build a Better Future, a volunteering strategy and action plan for Northern Ireland, which really rolls off the tongue. And that had 5 main aims, which you can see here. So recognizing the value of volunteering and promoting its benefits, enhancing accessibility and diversity, improving the volunteer experience, supporting and strengthening infrastructure around volunteering, and well, delivering on that strategy. So the final point is kind of do the previous 4. And there were 3 sections of this now decade-old volunteering strategy that particularly spoke to young people, or 3 kind of specific actions. The first was to enable children and young people to become involved in volunteering and help them to develop skills and gain experience through that volunteering, which the key performance indicators, unsurprisingly, were going to be more people being involved in volunteering and increased participation in the Millennium Volunteers program that Denise has already mentioned. The second action, which I see as a relatively unambitious one, was to deliver a series of roadshows to make young people aware of the benefits of volunteering and the opportunities available, with a goal of having 2,500 young people attending these roadshows each year. And the third and final action that specifically targeted young people was to enable careers information in schools to present volunteering as an option for gaining skills and experience. And the performance indicator there was the increased recognition of volunteering to support career development. My feeling is these were fairly unambitious goals. The targets and the performance measures were not huge numbers and not, I don't think, a step change in youth volunteering activity. In addition, this is now 10 years old. If this policy was a young person, they'd be preparing for senior school pretty soon. So there have been some sort of more particular policies recently, in particular the priorities for youth from 2013 from the Department of Education, rather focusing on youth work there, but with some references to young people as volunteers. There was then the Children and Young People Strategy 2019 to 2029 from the executive, with one of the 8 key outcomes being that young people can make a positive contribution to society, but that's written incredibly broadly and not specifically about volunteering. And then the final one is the Regional Youth Development Plan from 2020, written by or published by the Education Authority. And here the key kind of focus is on non-formal youth education. But there's a lot of talk about youth empowerment in designing of services. But actually, all the talk about volunteering is about adults volunteering in these services. There seems to be not recognition that young people kind of advocating for what services they want counts as volunteering or contributes to volunteering. So quite I think a relatively, again, unambitious and narrow piece of work. And in Northern Ireland, at least, that's broadly where we are. We're sitting on a 10-year-old strategy with some fairly small-scale updates. So the next step was to compare that to what's going on around the UK. Next slide. Thank you. So the Northern Irish strategy, being 10 years old, is the oldest of the 4 strategies. And here on this table of comparisons, what I've tried to get there is obviously the date, the scope in terms of whether the strategy looks at just volunteering or something bigger, the extent to which it focuses on young people, and the extent to which it's collaborative in terms of involving existing organisations, both infrastructure and volunteer involving on the ground, or the extent to which it's a top-down imposed from sort of central or regional government strategy. So you can see, as we've looked at, the Northern Irish strategy has explicit coverage of youth focus. This is covered in the core strategy in those 3 points, and then expanded in the associated policy documents. And it's broadly collaborative. The focus is on youth volunteering within existing youth services. It's narrow, as discussed, but it is collaborative. In England, we have the 2018 Civil Society Strategy. This is a much broader piece of work, covering a large expanse of civil society, from volunteering to charitable giving, even including things like adoption. But youth volunteering is explicitly covered in this strategy, but it's done so in a very top-down way. The focus is on 3 large national schemes, in some cases stretching across all 4 nations and in some cases limited to England. As a side note, the foreword for this, written by the then civil society minister, shows a complete lack of understanding of devolved powers. They almost used Britain and England interchangeably in the foreword, suggesting the minister really had no idea what they were talking about. But the focus is on large national schemes, National Citizen Service, the International Volunteer Scheme, and the I Will scheme. Little mention of existing organisations or structure, very much a top-down strategy. Scotland in 2019 published a national volunteering strategy, which in itself has very little coverage of youth volunteering specifically. It's quite broad, but has a companion co-produced with young people strategy for young people, which sits alongside and feeds in. So there is quite a detailed strategy, and it's very collaborative. The main strategy lists 7 types of partner organisations who are expected when working with volunteers to adhere and work to delivering this strategy, including for young people. So to deliver these policy goals around young people and wider volunteering. So really quite a well-developed strategy. In Wales, we have to go back to 2015, so almost as old as the strategy in Northern Ireland, for their most recent volunteering strategy, which has little or no specific coverage of youth volunteering issues. In fact, it's only in the last paragraph of this strategy that young people are mentioned at all. It's not that it's mentioning other age groups or groups of people, it's simply a very broad strategy, not really talking about young people or older people or people at any stage of life. But it is broadly collaborative. Again, a bit like Scotland strategy, it does identify key roles for volunteer involving organisations and for infrastructure groups. So England's strategy kind of stands out here as being different, being very top down, being very broad. Northern Ireland and Scotland, much more specific about their engagement with younger volunteers specifically, but in the case of Northern Ireland strategy now, increasingly dated. That's the policy context in which we are working. I'm now going to hand back to Dirk to talk you through our findings.
Many thanks, Eddie. Did I not say he was very competent in all that? Way more than I am. So great, Eddie. Thank you very much. So I'm going to take you through some of the data now. And before I flick over to the first slide, just as an advance warning, so there are tables and figures coming up, but hopefully I will talk you through those reasonably competently. That's my area of expertise now, dealing with large data. I haven't presented a huge amount of data, so it's probably 1 or 2 slides per data set looking at particular areas, and I've chosen those depending on where we get really the most relevant information from the respective surveys, starting with the continuous household survey. Again, just as a warning in advance, the age groups are always different, so they're not directly related to each other, but overall I think we have a consistent picture emerging around youth volunteering. So that's just the disclaimer at the start before I start with that. So let's look at the first continuous household survey again. So interviewer goes into the household and interviews everybody in the household about the experience. And of course, some of these young people in the household will be young people. The data is available in the UK Data Archive, and we've downloaded it and had a look at it and have tried to whether we can refigure the age groups to match them with Young Life and Times of YB, the Young Persons Behavior and Attitude Survey. But often when data are archived for secondary analysis, they're merged and put together in order to protect the individual identities of participants. So, and that was the case with the household survey. So we can only use the age groups that we are given. And these are the age groups that we have, 16 to 24, which is actually quite good and relates quite well to the strategy that we have, 25 to 34, 35 to 44, and so forth. So what you can see here, that actually over time, so this combines 3 survey sweeps, 17, 18, 18, 19, and 19, 20, as you can see. So you can see there's overall a relative consistency in terms of volunteering. You can see a little drop here in the gray bar that's 1920, and of course that coincides with COVID-19. You can see that the drop is highest amongst the youngest age group, and you would expect that because a lot of the volunteering takes place in schools, and of course the schools were off. So a lot of the programs that were available for volunteering for young people were not available in 1920 for large periods of the year, which explains the drop there. But overall, we can see that in particular in 2018-19, the youngest age group is actually the most likely age group to volunteer. Statistically, compared with the other age groups, they're not really very different. So overall, we can say from the continuous household survey that whilst young people in that age group, 16-24, are most likely to volunteer compared to the others, it's not significantly different from other age groups. So that's a relatively consistent picture. Now, if you wanted to interpret that, and again, that's an longitudinal survey. So the people who are in the 16 to 24 age groups will gradually move into the 24 to 34 age group and so forth, depending on how long they stay in the survey. But if you wanted to look at over time, you would see that probably there's a little drop in the sort of mid-20s, mid-30s. One could maybe argue that these are times when people are studying, sorting themselves out, buying their first homes, finding a job, and are busy with other things, maybe having children as well if they're forming a family. But then they come back into volunteering again. So that is what you could probably see from that data set. But generally, in relation to young people, they are the group that is most likely to volunteer, but not significantly more than the other age groups. So that's what we see from the continuous household survey. And one more slide on the continuous household survey, and that's looking at the time spent volunteering. Okay, and we can see here that young people are actually least likely to volunteer long periods of time. So the 20s, 17 hours plus is significantly less likely to occur at the age group of 16 to 34. And again, you can see here that the way the data is merged is different. Again, looking after the cell count and making sure that nobody can be identified. But generally speaking, what we can see here that it's the highest proportion among 16 and 34-year-olds who have the least hours of volunteering. And again, as we will see later, that speaks quite well to sort of competing commitments that in particular young people have with school, part-time jobs, and so forth. Overall, what we can see is that young people are most likely to volunteer less than 8 hours per week. So short-term, condensed volunteering opportunities seem to be what young people are going for. And that, as we will see later, is reflected also in the focus group data that we've collected. Okay, and moving on to Young Life in Times then. And as I said in the introduction, so we've worked with Volunteer Now, or as it was at the time, Volunteer Service Bureau, for a number of years. And I'm referring to two survey slips here, one in 2009 and one in 2017, and also comparing males with females. So just as a reminder, we're looking at 16-year-olds now when we look at the data set. Okay, so and this is looking here at volunteering experience over the last 12 months. So that's when they were 15 to 16 years of age. Okay, so as we can see, the females were more likely to volunteer than the males. So that came out quite well. In particular, when it comes to informal volunteering, if you look at that, and some people who have volunteered formally and informally, you can see there's a small proportion of that, but there's very little gender difference in relation to that, and the data is reasonably consistent over the years. Having said that, a proportion of females that stated that they've never volunteered compared to 2009 and 2017 had dropped significantly. So we can see that there's a higher proportion of females in 2017 that volunteered than in 2009. In terms of the males, quite consistent data overall, and what it shows is probably that between the the years of 2009 and 2017, there's relative consistency in the proportion of young people that volunteer. Looking at the kind of activities that young people are involved in, and I'm only looking at the last surveys we appeared in 2017, the data suggests, and that was the same in 2009, that the vast majority were involved in helping to run or, an event or an activity. And we know that this is predominantly school-based. And the same is also true for taking part in fundraising or sponsored events, which are often organized through schools. But there was also a quite large proportion of those who volunteered who are actually already involved in charities and charitable organizations, or involved in good causes and over more long-term basis. And I've seen that some of the participants here in the seminar today, of course, work for organizations like and a lot of the young people would have volunteering experiences for that, but also for sports organizations. There was still quite a large proportion connected to religious organizations and churches, as you can see. So sport we've covered and the charities we've covered. But compared to 2009, this proportion has really significantly decreased. And that's in line with the finding that we have in Young Life and Times over time, that the religious affiliation amongst young people has decreased significantly since 2003, when we first started the survey. So fewer and fewer young people are related and identify with religious organizations or with religions generally. So in the last year's survey, we had for the first time over half who said they were not religiously affiliated, and that is probably reflected as well in the volunteering data as well. Okay, I'm moving on to barriers to volunteering, and again, that is Young Life and Times 2017. I've briefly alluded to that earlier in terms of multiple commitments, and that comes up very clearly here, in particular for females, 64%. If you look at the bottom here, high levels of schoolwork, we do know that females, in particular when it comes to GCSE, are more likely to learn, more likely to study, more likely to give up engagement or involvement in sports organizations and so forth, because they focus more on schoolwork than males would do. So, but overall, 50% of Young Life and Times respondents said that high level of schoolwork was one of the reasons why they stopped volunteering or didn't volunteer. And they also generally talk about other commitments, and that could be part-time jobs, some of them with caring responsibilities and so forth. In terms of actually, making an impact, for people who are in this call today, in this launch, so the areas which are probably more of interest, because we can't do very much about other commitments in schoolwork, but the areas which are more important in terms of making changes, in terms of involving young people, are the ones at the top of the slide here. So there's an issue around the appreciation. I mean, quite a small proportion of young people expressed that, 4% overall, that they felt that their input wasn't always appreciated, and we will come back to that. Friends is a much bigger issue, in particular for males, as you can see. So there's a significant difference between males and females. Only 6% of the females said that none of their friends volunteered, and that's why they didn't. For males, that was much more important. So for providing opportunities, in particular for males, to volunteer together with their friends seems to be one way of making sure that they are involved in volunteering. The other issue, having never thought about volunteering, is something that, again, is probably related to finding out about volunteering, and just generally communicating the benefits that volunteering can have for young people in terms of their CVs, but also in terms of the general tangible life skills that they can get from volunteering. So that seems to be really important. The last point I want to make in relation to that is really that about 1 in 10 young people felt that they haven't got the right skills and experience to volunteer. So the expectation of themselves to be skilled to do volunteering jobs, and I remember very distinctly from watching the online focus groups with volunteer involving organizations, but also talking to young people directly for this project, that very much the message was in the focus groups that there's a job for anybody who wants to volunteer. So they're not necessarily high-skilled jobs. They can by all means be high-skilled jobs, but it's not necessary. So it's just sort of communicating that if they want to be involved in volunteering, we'll find you a job to do that. There'll be an opportunity that we create. So that seems to be coming out of that. Last but not least, I want to come to the Young Persons Behavior and Attitude Survey. Again, as a reminder from what I said before, so these are post-primary schools in Northern Ireland, to 12 years up to 18 years. And again, looking at the frequency here, you can see that they're most likely to say that they volunteer about once a week. 22% of the respondents said that, and or a few times a year as well. So that is most likely to happen. 18% said they volunteer a few times a week. So these are likely to be young people who are involved in charities or organizations or sports clubs or church organizations and so forth. Not in school, perhaps. Again, looking at the areas of volunteering, so sports and exercise comes out very strongly, and young people's activities outside school. So these could be youth clubs, clubs organized, run by the Education Authority, but also voluntary community organizations, church and faith-based organizations. So it's remarkably similar to Young Life and Times here. 19% say that is where they volunteer. And the options were slightly different from Young Life and Times, but you can see here that 13% of those who did say they volunteered through schools. Okay, last, before I come to our recommendations, I want to summarize the main themes that have emerged out of the focus groups. And I've broken those down into the young people on the left and the policymakers and organizations on the right. So I'm starting with the young people. There was very much a sense that amongst the young people that we were talking to, that they want to have more say and control in the volunteering activities that they're involved in. A lot of the organizations, including some of those who were attending the online focus groups and who are here today, talked very passionately about mechanisms that they've put in place now, where young people are involved in the running of the organizations and obviously have a say also about the activities that they're involved in. But that wasn't the case for a lot of the organizations, and that wasn't the experience for many of the young people that we were talking to. And the desire was very clearly there that should be done, that they should have a say in what they're doing, that should be an opportunity for them to express and shape the volunteering experiences as well. Very strongly, they wanted the volunteering experience to be meaningful for them, meaningful for the communities. There was very clear evidence that they appreciated opportunities which were time limited. By all means, there were young people who were involved, and we talked to some of them who were involved over many years in volunteering in organizations. But the majority of the young people, and that comes out, that connects well with the survey data, are talking about time limited, flexible projects where there are tangible, meaningful outcomes. They do appreciate opportunities to try themselves out without any sort of pressure to try new things, learn new skills, make new friends, improve their CVs. And in terms of improvements, some of the young people expressed difficulties in finding out about volunteering opportunities. So the communication channels probably need to be improved. And some of them felt very strongly that there should be celebratory or recognizing events for the achievements, for their contribution, like a positive celebration of the contributions that young people make to the organizations or the communities in which they volunteer. As far as barriers are concerned, they talked about the information flow and how some of the tools that young people use to communicate with each other were not supposed to be used by the organizations to communicate opportunities for WhatsApp, Instagram, Snapchat, things like that, because of data security concerns. And they felt that as a consequence of that, they didn't receive the information in the way they probably needed to receive information. They talked very strongly about other commitments, pressures in school, work-related commitments, and also in the case of young people in rural areas about transport issues, getting to places and so forth. When it comes to policymakers and organizations, they did notice that there was a lack of strategy. So what Eddie was reporting earlier, that the strategy we have in place is quite aged and dated, was recognized. They talked about their desire to involve young people more in decision-making processes, but they also talked about some of the organizational constraints and frameworks that are in place, which limit sometimes the way young people can be involved. And they specifically talked about some of the health and safety regulations, data sharing, GDPR, and so forth, which sometimes can create barriers for them to involve young people in the way they want to. Not that they were saying that health and safety isn't important, not at all, but they were saying it sets a particular framework which has to be managed in a professional way, and that sometimes constrains the flexibility that is required to work with young people. It was very clear that there are costs and resources involved in volunteering, and the participants in the focus groups were very clear and said volunteering is not free for them as an organization. They have to resource it. They have to make sure that that young people have positive experiences, and they felt that sometimes that isn't acknowledged. That is something that they are getting for free, or that they don't have to put staff resources into, and they very clearly said, well, that's not the case. Actually, what I personally found really interesting was this debate about altruism versus instrumentalism. So the young people who come in to do good to the community versus the young people who come in to do good for their own CV, right? And I was surprised to see that the organizations didn't have very many issues with that. They said, that's okay. We can deal with that. We know they come in for a period of time. We know it's important for them. It's an opportunity for them to try themselves out. If they want to stick it in their CV in order to get a better university, that's fine. And actually, some of them realize when they do get involved in volunteering, they stay. So they had much less problems with that than I would have personally anticipated. And yeah, some of the barriers they are referring to were bureaucracy and resourcing, safeguarding transport and retention of volunteers, as I've already alluded to. So last but not least, one set of recommendations, 2 slides. So I think it is evident that we need an updated Northern Ireland youth volunteering policy. We've got the one which is the oldest in the UK, it's most dated. And actually one of the specifics working with young people is that the youth sector is really dynamic and changes very quickly. So the policy needs to be probably, a policy in youth volunteering probably need to be reviewed more regularly than other policies. And that's overdue. And Eddie has explained that really well. I think all the data shows very clearly that the young people want to be engaged in shaping volunteering policy and strategy, and also shaping volunteering opportunities on the ground. So just listening more to them, involving them a wee bit more, and helping them make decisions about what they actually want to volunteer in, what they are passionate about is really important, rather than presenting with opportunities and bringing in a pound on Uniform Free Day or something like that in order to give money to charity, which of course is important as well, but they wanted to have more say in what they want to do and what they want to be involved in. And I think we need to take that serious. I think it was also very clear that with the disappearance of the Millennium Volunteer Scheme, a lot of the celebratory aspects of recognizing young people's contributions, positive contributions to community have disappeared. And young people felt very strongly that when they give time and resources and space and thinking and energy to communities and organizations, they want us to be recognized. And as somebody who's involved in youth research, I would say it's probably related to the fact that there's often a lot of negativity about young people in the media when something doesn't go wrong, whether it's St. Patrick's Day or celebrating after A-levels and taking alcohol and all the rest of it. So the media tends to report on young people in a negative way. And young people, of course, are aware of it. So they want a positive recognition of the contributions that they make to the community and to the organizations. And last slide, I think it is clear that we need to think about the way we communicate with young people about volunteering opportunities. The evidence, both from organizations and from young people, is clear that there are some barriers, and we need to get better with that, more flexible and actually use the channels that young people use themselves. We need to be better in actually communicating what the benefits of youth volunteering are. I think there are very good mechanisms already in place, but we can get better at that. And if young people who are thinking about volunteering understand that they can build skills that can help them in their CVs, help them in their jobs, they're probably more inclined to get involved in volunteering as well and see it as an investment in their own future. And last but not least, I talked about the difficulties in bringing all these data sets together. I'm not suggesting that Volunteer Now or anybody else should use Young Life and Times from now on, always, and nothing else. What I'm suggesting is that we need to have a conversation about how volunteering data is systematically collected, in what way, and the data at the moment don't speak very well to each other. I think it would be useful to think about a instrument, whatever instrument that is, to monitor youth volunteering on a regular basis and allow us to build a proper time series which shows changes and trends over time. And that's it. I'm going to stop sharing now. Thank you very much for listening to us. I think it was maybe slightly over, but not too much. So, Denise, I'm handing over to you. I think you are taking this from now on.
Yes, thank you. First of all, before we move on to our small discussion groups, I wondered whether anybody has any specific questions for Dirk or for Eddie that you want to just throw in at the moment.